Not quite. Just combed it back because it's more comfortable that way. It's hanging over my ears. It's driving me nuts. Gosh. Ugh.
I'm hoping like maybe next week. I don't know.
Better be soon or it's going to be bald, Jeff.
Mama's flowers was starting.
Not quite, but it will be soon.
Dancing.
You so silly.
Is he happy?
Huh?
Is he mad?
Who?
Dad? Here? Yeah?
I have no idea why it's still making me show up as Autumn, but just going to do the best we can. Got a couple people in the waiting room. It's 7 o'clock. Autumn is going to make me the co-host of this meeting so that I can share screens and do some other cool stuff. I really appreciate Autumn helping all the time, making sure that we have the ability to monitor who's coming and going and making the best of our time together. I hope tonight will be a good Bible class for us. We're going to keep going on with our study on some of these Bible themes, trying to understand some of these Bible topics. Last week we looked at holiness, and so we're going to carry that over into our study tonight and see how holiness begins to influence who and what we are, how we work. So I appreciate people that are watching on Boxcast. I know that if you're on Roku or Boxcast channel, that you've got the opportunity to view it, but not to participate. Then it is being sent over to our Facebook stream. And we've got 10 or more folks over at Facebook who are watching and connecting with us that way. We've had some comments. For instance, Michael Burns said that, Jeff, you look a little bit like Larry King with the haircut you got going on tonight. So I thought that was pretty good. So we're all here together, and it's good to be able to do that and be able to send our video to a whole bunch of different places. Let's see. I'm going to see if I can pull something up here and share the screen. My computer reset, or I needed to reset it, so I had to do a couple of things, but try to share that right there with you. So I don't know if you saw this on Facebook or not a little while ago. I try to put something online for us to just get us jogging, get us thinking about things. And while the day is going on, we're going to watch a video here in just a minute, but I mentioned that in addition to talking about the Bible Project video, that we were also going to talk about my obnoxiously uneven nostrils. Hopefully you can see the picture there. That's just a static image. I could use it's the same camera that I used to take the picture. I don't know if you've noticed in the past, it's bothered me, bugged me for a long time. Share with you why I have these obnoxiously uneven nostrils. I was a pretty rowdy guy when I was a kid, pretty rough and tumble, and was not necessarily always the nicest person to be around in my younger years. I got into a lot of fights. My mom had to come pick me up a lot of times, especially in elementary school. I remember one time there was a kid on the playground who kept messing with me, and I remember that I had watched a movie where they had done some karate moves, and I wanted to try out this karate kick that I had seen on this TV show. And I kicked this kid, and the next thing I know, I have to go home, and we're being told that his mom took him to the hospital. So that was a bad day. In middle school, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding between me and somebody that I thought was my friend, but we were in gym, and you guys remember middle school gym. You have to go to the locker room before that. Something happened. There was, again, misunderstanding. I was completely innocent in the whole thing, but he thought I had done something that I had not done and came up behind me and punched me in the back of the head. Caught me off guard. I didn't even know it was coming up. And I turned around, and as you know how things go in a group of guys, especially in middle school, immediately there was a circle around us with the chant going, fight, so I assumed our job was to fight each other. And so I got into a fight in the middle school. It didn't last very long. I remember I hit him one time. That was the only punch that I threw in the whole thing. The whole thing was probably over in 12 seconds, but I punched him, and he fell down to the ground, didn't get back up. And so I ran and hid in the shower until everybody was gone. And then we got into high school and I was trying to behave myself a lot better. So those are just a couple examples from much younger years. And we're sitting in the auditorium at the school, you know, where you have your assemblies and everything like that. I don't remember what we were doing, but we were just hanging out. There were two guys sitting behind me and they were just jerks. And they kept thumping me in the back of the head and thumping my ears. And of course, my ears are fairly large targets, so it wasn't very hard to do that. And they kept talking about how big my ears were and thumping them. And I kept telling them to stop. And I wasn't having a good time at all. And so I remember turning around and just telling them they needed to quit. And one of the two of them stood up. And so I stood up. Now, what I did not know at the time was that him standing up was his invitation to fight. And apparently my standing up was not only accepting that invitation, but it was me giving him an invitation to punch me in the face. And he didn't wait for a second offer. And he took me up on that, apparently. I didn't know that's what I had given him, but he caught me right here and broke my nose in high school. I remember it. I remember turning around and just walking away, walk to the bathroom. There was another part of me that wanted to do something else. But ever since then, I've had this crooked nose. And of course, you've noticed it before, but let's just pretend that you didn't notice it before. Now you'll notice it forever. And Brittany McGuire needs to change the name on hers because I know Brittany's not typing into the chat box. I know that it's Barron talking about the crook in my nose that way. I didn't know if anybody else, we got, you know.
Me and Brittany both said we have never noticed any crookedness of your nose. You were pulling something out of a hat because we've never noticed that a day in our lives.
No, you got to go back.
You look beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Barron. I do. I appreciate that. But Autumn can attest that my nostrils are not the same size and it affects my sleeping and the noises that I make when I'm asleep. Because she went out when it was time for us to buy a new bed. She made sure to get one of those beds that can adjust its angle. And it has that one little button on it that's called the anti-snore button. And one of the reasons that that's my problem is my nostrils are uneven because my nose cocks over in this direction. Not a great day. I got some, I'm not just telling that story randomly, but before I get into the explanation of what that has to do with anything, I wanted to throw it out for some interaction. I wondered if anybody else had any kind of stories. Is anybody else? I want to be careful how I use the term battle scars because there are people here who have actually been in actual battles. But does anybody else have any marks from interactions, altercations they've had with anybody they want to share? All right, good. I'm not the only one. Deirdre, you've got something. Unmute yourself and share us the real quick details of your story. No, you're still muted. We may have, there you go. Go ahead.
Chelsea got it. When I was in the 3rd grade, I was told not to go over to this certain area of the mobile home park that we lived in. And there was a swing set over there. And I don't know who talked me into going over. It might have been myself. It might have been my friend. But I was on that. There was a horse on that swing set. And while I was swinging on it, the horse flipped over. I landed on my back and the horse's head hit me in the nose and split it all the way through. So I have one nostril bigger than the other two.
There you go. All right. So I'm glad I'm not the only one specific to the nose issue. Rhinoplasty, by the way, that's what it's called when you go get the plastic surgery to correct your nose. I have had doctors offer me some rhinoplasty in the past. But anyway, we're not going to talk about my nose job. All right, Jeff, you got something you want to share? 1 or 2 stories, I bet.
Oh, I was just saying I had that operation twice.
Really? It did
Yeah.
wonders for you.
Yeah, the first time I ever rode in an ambulance was early 82, Camp Lejeune.
I love how you start the
Was,
story
we
with
were
the
having a
first
talk-
time that I rode in an ambulance, but keep going.
Yeah, it was a soccer match. And so the ball was in the air. I looked up, I was going to head the ball. And I saw the ball and the lights went out. Somebody else had the same idea, except they got me instead of the ball.
Oh,
So it basically left side, I cracked my orbital. I broke my nose. It was actually an open fracture because then I had 2 surgeries later on in life to be able to breathe. But I got a couple more funny stories. All right, Adam and Autumn. I don't know. You guys know Liz, right?
oh yeah.
Okay. I think she was in middle school or elementary school. But anyway, and then there's Tori. Well, Tori was walking home one day and she was walking with this kid that lived across the street, and these bullies were picking on him. So she got tired of it, and particularly this one kid, and she beat the crap out of him right across the street. So anyway, I don't know how much time later, maybe a month or so, or I can't remember how much time. I'm at the this complex on base where all the kids were after school and such, and there was something going on with Beverly, I think. It was like a gymnastics class or something. And an MP walked up to me and said, "Are you Chief Warrant Officer Ziegler?" And I said, "Well, yeah." Says, "Well, I need to talk to you about your daughter." So he said, he went on to say how Liz had another kid at the playground. And I said, "No, you mean Tori, right?" He goes, "No, it's Elizabeth, dark hair, blah, 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 blah." And I was like, no, you got this wrong. Because Liz was always sweet and mild mannered and all this other weird stuff. So that was kind of a shock, but it was funny.
Oh my. So they were dishing out some they were dishing
That's all
out.
I have to share.
Probably that's all that's declassified at least. So we'll probably leave it at that. But yeah, I think a lot of us have, and that's just one story. I mean, I've got some others and we could keep swapping stories, but I was thinking about how easy it is for us to point out broken bones or cuts or scrapes or scars or things like that prove times in our lives where things didn't go the way that we wanted them to, or people didn't treat us the way that we thought that they should, and it left a mark on us or some kind or another. We're going to kind of circle back to that for the last part of our lesson tonight as we think about the next step in this study series. Again, this is material that's put together by the Bible Project. That's the website, the Bible Project. Of course, just like everything else is done by people, I don't agree with everything that's on there. There's several things on that website that I wouldn't agree with, but they have a really good way of putting visuals together, and they make those visuals available to use for settings like this. So I appreciate them making that available for us and presenting some themes. Last week we looked at holiness and what God's holiness is, and how God's holiness is so good that it actually becomes dangerous for us who are not holy until God's holiness takes over our lives, and then we become holy because of what Christ did. But tonight, what I want to do is I want to take that a step further, and I want to see where that begins to take us after we think about that. So we see God's holiness, and now we're going to ask ourselves how that plays out in our everyday lives with this next video that's going to talk about justice for a little bit. And I've got a couple of questions. The first thing I'm going to throw out while we're watching the video, they're going to use a couple of terms just very quickly, but I want us to start talking about this when we pick back up. And I'm just going to ask you some questions about the video and present one or two ideas. Justice is both positive and negative. In other words, justice is both giving and taking. What I mean by that, they're going to use a couple of terms. It is retribution. Justice can be retribution, retributive justice, and justice can be restorative or restoration. Negative and positive aspects of justice. I want you to see if you can catch that in the video, what they mean by that, but also think about the concept of justice that's going to be presented here in this video, and think about what comments or questions you've got about it, because I want us to discuss. And then I will say this, the comments over on Facebook, Jane Cooper specifically says, people must not notice me as much as I thought, because nobody has said anything about noticing my crooked nose. So I guess I gave you that one for free, but think about this video as we watch about what justice means from the Bible perspective, and we'll talk about it in about 5 minutes.
If you were a praying mantis, it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate.
And if you're a honey badger, you have no regard for other animals. You don't care.
If you're a panda with twins, it's normal to abandon one to take care of the other.
But if humans do any of these things, we would call it wrong, unfair, or unjust.
Yeah, why is that? Why do humans care so much about justice?
Well, the Bible has a fascinating response to that question. On page 1, humans are set apart from all other creatures as the image of God.
Yeah, God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil.
And this identity, it's the bedrock of the Bible's view of justice. All humans are equal before God and have the right to be treated with dignity and fairness no matter who you are.
And that would be nice if we all did that. But we know how the world really works.
And the Bible addresses that too. It shows how we are constantly redefining good and evil to our own advantage at the expense of others.
Yeah, self-preservation. And the weaker someone is, the easier it is to take advantage of them.
And so in the biblical story, we see this happening on a personal level, but also in families, and then in communities, and in whole civilizations that create injustice, especially towards the vulnerable. But the story doesn't end there. Out of this whole mess, God chose a man named Abraham to start a new kind of family. Specifically, Abraham was to teach his family to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice.
Yeah, doing righteousness, that's a Bible word I don't really use, but what comes to mind is being a good person.
But what does that even mean, being good? The biblical Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedakah, and it's more specific. It's an ethical standard that refers to right relationships between people. It's about treating others as the image of God,
with the God-given dignity they deserve.
And this word justice, it's the Hebrew word mishpat. It can refer to retributive justice.
Like if I steal something, I pay the consequences.
Exactly. Yet most often in the Bible, mishpat refers to restorative justice. It means going a step further, actually seeking out vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them.
Yeah, some people call this charity.
But mishpat involves way more. It means taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and changing social structures to prevent injustice.
So justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life.
Yeah, and you find this idea all over the Bible. Like here, in the book of Proverbs, what does it mean to bring about just righteousness?
Open your mouth for those who can't speak for themselves.
And what do these words mean for the prophets, like Jeremiah?
Rescue the disadvantaged, and don't tolerate oppression or violence against the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow.
And like here, look in the book of Psalms.
The Lord God upholds justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets the prisoner free. But he thwarts the way of the wicked. Whoa, he thwarts the wicked?
Yeah, in Hebrew, the word wicked is rasha. It means guilty or in the wrong. It refers to someone who mistreats another human, ignoring their dignity as an image of God.
So justice and righteousness is a big deal to God.
Yes, it's what Abraham's family, the Israelites, were to be all about. They ended up as immigrant slaves being oppressed unjustly in Egypt. And so God confronted Egypt's evil, declaring them to be rasha, guilty of injustice. And so he rescued Israel. But the tragic irony of the Old Testament story is that these redeemed people went on to commit the same acts of injustice against the vulnerable. And so God sent prophets who declared Israel guilty.
But they weren't the only ones. There's injustice everywhere.
Yeah, some people actively perpetrate injustice. Others receive benefits or privileges from unjust social structures they take for granted. And sadly, history has shown that when the oppressed gain power, they often become oppressors themselves.
So we all participate in injustice, actively or passively, even unintentionally. We're all the guilty ones.
And so this is the surprising message of the biblical story. God's response to humanity's legacy of injustice is to give us a gift, the life of Jesus. He did righteousness and justice, and yet he died on behalf of the guilty. But then God declared Jesus to be the righteous one when he rose from the dead. And so now Jesus offers his life to the guilty so that they too can be declared righteous before God, not because of anything they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them.
The earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as a power that changed their lives and compelled them to act in surprising new ways.
Yeah, if God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response is to go and seek righteousness and justice for others.
This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient or easy. It's courageously making other people's problems my problems.
This is what Jesus meant by loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about a lifetime commitment fueled by the words of the ancient prophet Micah. God has told you, humans, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. It's to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
All right, so there's a quick little 5-minute video on what justice means. It takes a passage from Micah and tells us that we should love justice. I want to compare what justice means, get your thoughts on that. So let's start first of all with how justice has both a positive and a negative aspect to it. Talks about retributive justice versus restorative justice. Who's watching here that has a thought on that, or what that means to be negative and positive in its aspects of justice?
Well, retributive justice is not like necessarily negative, I would think, right? Like the idea of someone being punished for a crime is not negative. It's just what happens. I guess it perspective wise.
Okay, yeah, maybe let me clarify what I mean by negative. I don't mean negative in a sense that, oh, that's bad. I mean negative in the sense of taking away. You know, that in their punishment, they're being restricted or something is being removed from them because they've done something that was deserving of punishment or something. And then on the positive side, restorative, when you restore something to someone, their possession was taken or their dignity was taken or their, safety was taken, and you restore those things. That's kind of what I'm thinking about, Baron. What have you got?
Well, on that, I would say, the idea, I had a thought. Man, I hate when that happens. I had a thought. I'll let someone else talk and I'll.
That's fine. I saw Autumn had a hand up. We'll go with Autumn and then Jim. So Autumn, go ahead.
I've always thought of justice as being this, rock that's in the middle. And if you're on one side of it, it's the, retributive side. And if you're on the other side, you're on the restorative side. So I don't think of it necessarily as two separate things. It's just whether you're the offender or the receiver as to which side of it that you're on.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good image. Yeah, thanks. Jim, go ahead and be unmuting yourself. You had a hand up a second ago, so I want to hear what your thoughts are on this idea of justice.
Well, I was just thinking about today. They had the woman with the hairdressing, the hairdresser that had her business open, and parts of her, what she thought was justified was her being open to be able to feed her kids. But what the laws basically said was that, you need to be closed because you're not, what you're doing is breaking the law. So her idea of justice was feeding her kids, but then again, the law says that this is what we say. So there was two different versions of what justice really was. I mean, she was looking at one way and they were looking at it in another way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sometimes we have doubts and differences on what is justice, and what can seem just to one person might to another person seem like they're being taken advantage of or being, abused. And that's a very real possibility. Yeah. Baron, do you remember what you had?
Yeah, I did. I was thinking about the eye for an eye, like a common idiom from the Old Testament is actually a search for justice.
Right.
If you and that's really what a lot of the laws were based off of, was if you take something, or if you are steal something, then the price to pay would be the equivalent of that, or something along those lines. And so really it's interesting that Jesus says, you heard it was eye for an eye, which eye for an eye is a search for justice. Someone took something from you, what that person needs to do to repay, to have, what you're talking about, they have to pay it back like equally. So.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. How we seek justice and what happens, the ripples of that. We've all heard the consequence of an eye for a world that is lived an eye for an eye makes everybody blind. The rippling consequences of that in some people's mind means it needs to be re-examined. But justice as a concept, I think the way that it talks about it in this video is pretty important. I think all of us would agree that we want to live in a just society. We want to live in a world that is just, where we're not mistreated and we are considered to be equals, and that the Bible, it's fascinating. It's interesting that the Bible seems to go to great lengths to try and raise that equality, so that all people can be treated equal, or, as one of our documents as Americans, all people are created equal. Of course, our document doesn't say all people, does it? So we've had to kind of wrestle with that and the language there, even though we take it to mean mankind, that all mankind is created equal. And we've been endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And what is that equality? What is it that makes all of us in this room right now equal, no matter what other standards or stations or qualifications we may have?
Being made in the image of God.
Right. And, I think the video kind of talks about that, reminds us back in Genesis that the creation, that there was equality in mankind because of our status as being made in the image of God, both male and female. All of us carry that and we're supposed to honor that. And so being just is in part seeking the equality that all of us are supposed to have with one another in ways that a lot of people around the world don't get to experience. Can you think of some examples of injustice around the world, or cases? It doesn't have to be a specific case, but just kind of what's an example of people being treated unfairly because and it being a matter of injustice or inequality?
Taiwan.
Okay, yeah, we were talking about that the other day. Baron and I were, and this whole, is there one China or are there two Chinas, and what the government's doing, to oppress people and keep the message from getting out. That's a pretty big deal.
Haiti.
Yeah, it's interesting how politics plays a pretty large role in this, and that's part of our recognition with this lesson tonight is people who get power tend to want to keep power, and the best way that you can keep power is by making sure nobody else gets it, and so whether it's corruption or bribery or force or oppression of another kind, quite often people get themselves in scenarios where they're not being just in their treatment of other people in an effort to keep a hold of whatever power, they've been able to put together. I liked in the video how it started off with Egypt, right? And in Egypt, the Israelites were the victims. And for 400 years, they faced that difficulty and that oppression and that injustice. And then God delivers them and gives them the land of milk and honey, that takes them to the land of Canaan, where they become the folks that are in charge. And by the time you have the end of the Old Testament, what have most of the Israelites, especially those who have means, who have wealth and who have land and who have privilege and power, what have they become? They've become the victimizers, the very people, once they are removed. I believe that there's a place in Proverbs. Somebody can use your Bible Gateway or use your Bible app on your phone. Check me on this. In Proverbs, it talks about the three things to fear, even four that are frightening. And one of them that it mentions is a maid who is somehow given power over her household, who becomes the lady of the house or something like that. A serving girl who starts off in a lowly position, but then is granted, somehow she gets, the upper hand in the household. And the book of Proverbs says you got to watch out for somebody like that. I'm pretty sure that's going to be at the end of Proverbs. There's several lists of those lists there. So a couple people, let's see who can find that first and kind of remind us about how easy it is for the victims to become victimizers when they're put into positions where they can abuse other people. And of course, we know, unfortunately, that happens in families a lot of times as well. People that grow up oftentimes with some kind of abuse or some kind of mistreatment, oftentimes, if they don't learn a better way, grow up and repeat that same cycle, in houses and in families. It just continues on. And that injustice is painful. It's painful to watch, but it's especially painful, to be a part of. And so our goal is to try to stop the spread of that. So I'm just kind of keeping up with our comments and things. I appreciate Autumn. She's doing some good stuff over there. We've had a couple of questions. Michael Burns says a lot of people think the golden rule means that he who has the gold makes the rules, right? I don't know if you've heard that. First time I heard that was in Aladdin. That was in the Aladdin movie, the cartoon with Robin Williams a long time ago. But it's not the first time it was ever spoken, because there are an awful lot of people that think the purpose of money is to get power. And then you use that wealth to amass your own power so that you can do what you want to do. I promise I didn't make up that verse in Proverbs. Hopefully one of you guys or ladies is going to be able to find it for me. Maybe on Facebook, if you can find it as well, look for it. I just don't want to look like I'm making things up, I promise. But so we're thinking about justice. What I want to do for a minute is connect the ideas from last week to this week. What are your thoughts? How does holiness and justice, how do those two concepts meet? How do they intersect? How do they intertwine? why, what are some things that you can think of that bring us together when we think about God's holiness that he gives to us, and then the concept or the notion of justice in the world around us? Does anybody have any thoughts? You be turning your Bible over to Isaiah chapter 5, but I'd really like to hear if can you connect? How can you connect justice and holiness as we turn to Isaiah 5?
I don't know.
All right. Go ahead, Autumn. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if this is completely right or not, but when I think of holiness, I think more of the ritual side of being good. And when I think of justice, I think more of the moral side of being good.
Okay.
And they, both are necessary.
Great. Okay. I like that. Richard had a hand up, so I'll let Richard unmute, and then we'll go over to Jeff. And thank you, Baron, or mostly Brittany. I'll talk about, it's been found, it's been located. But Richard, what you got?
A holy life is one that will also be just.
A holy life will be just. I think that's important. I think that's an important distinction to make. Good. Yeah. Baron?
Hey, I think Jeff waved his hand. Brittany keeps telling me it's Jeff's turn.
Well, Jeff found Proverbs. Is that
Yeah.
right? Jeff, you were going to tell us you found Proverbs? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. But I'm thinking of Leviticus 19, be holy as I am holy. And then it gets into like sacrificial laws, which is interesting. But most of the laws in that chapter are don't trip blind people, don't make fun of deaf people, don't steal, like these things that have nothing to do with ritual purity, which of course in the very beginning and on it's talking about ritual purity, but it's interesting that he connects holiness with things that God would do, and God wouldn't trip blind people. He wouldn't stick a foot out in front of a blind person and trip them, or he wouldn't make fun of the deaf and call them stupid. He wouldn't do that. He would treat them with love and compassion, which Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. So then that's where Jesus is getting at. So I think there's an argument to say that he's encouraging them to be holy as God is holy when he says that second greatest commandment.
Right. And I agree with that. In Isaiah chapter 5, there's this reading in verse 16 that says that the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. So I think that kind of ties into what Richard was saying, and then again to some of the ways that Baron brought that out as well, this idea that because God is holy, his justice and his righteousness are grow out from that. Because of his holiness, his ultimate goodness, it's impossible for him to turn away on being just and being righteous. And for us then to act justly is what we have to find the ability to do. And I loved how the video kind of showed this, kind of went back and forth with the notion of these white banners, this white cloth that was draped over people when they're treating each other justly, when they're treating each other well, helping one another. And then when there's injustice, it's this red, thread, this red cape that drapes over first in Egypt, but then it wraps around the Israelites and individuals who behave in an unjustly fashion, trying to find trying to make peace between those two opposing elements, those two problems. All right, Jim. Yeah, I see your hand up. Go ahead. Unmute. Well, unmute yourself first, and then tell us what you're thinking.
I was just thinking that God's holiness and justice has got to be able to punish evil. I mean, you think about, I think both of those are requirement. He requires both of those in order to be able to punish evil things or evil deeds.
Absolutely. And that's, that's where we get into some sticky issues sometimes, because it feels like that's being cruel, but in order to be just, sometimes we have to prohibit things from happening and things from taking place, and that involves punishment. Baron, go ahead.
I think it's even interesting to on that point that Jesus's death conquers those injustices. That is what the enemy is, because a lot of injustices cause death. You're thinking about political powers that put people under, their thumb. Well, the worst enemy that we can experience is death. And Paul says that last enemy, which is death, 1 Corinthians 15, has been put under his feet. So
Right.
I do like how Jim said that, but it goes even further in Jesus's death, that he conquers those things through the church, through his work in the church.
It's prohibitive and then or retributive, and then and then it becomes restorative. Jesus' death is what restores. And we talked about, that death last week. Richard, go ahead. I see you got a thought. Go ahead and mute.
There can't be justice without a standard. So holiness has to be there in order for there to be justice.
Right. Holiness is the standard by which justice is achieved. And that's a good point. I'll read us Proverbs chapter 30 just to prove that I wasn't making things up. Around verse 21 and 22. Under 3 things the earth trembles, under 4 it cannot bear up. A slave when he becomes king, a maidservant when she displaces her mistress. Now, how a maidservant displaces her mistress, that might be an interesting conversation for another day. But the point is that when those power structures get flipped, when people who were on the bottom get the chance to be on top, a lot of times they take advantage of that opportunity to become the abusers and the accusers. I'm going to mention Christy over on Facebook. She had a comment, the martyrs that die for being Christians. And then sometimes murderers get away with their crimes because they might live where Christianity is not acceptable. That's injustice. That's a good example. I think that makes a good point. Sometimes people get away with crimes, persecution of Christians, even to the point of their murder, their death. Obviously, that's something that's been going on for many years. But it can be big things. It can be small things. But I think what we have to recognize is that injustices oftentimes start small, but then they grow because we live in a world that sometimes allows those things to incubate and grow and become larger. When I'm thinking about injustice, I'm thinking about today. Today I went walking in my neighborhood, and I do that. I'm trying to do that a lot more while we're doing this isolation stuff. I then go home and eat a lot of food, so it's not really doing the results that I want. But the point is that I'm getting out there doing some walking. I've done today 5 miles walking through the neighborhood, jogging different times. Obviously, I don't jog as far, but a lot of you maybe have done that too. Jogging through the neighborhood, minding my own business, listening to headphones, just doing my thing. If you were in the neighborhood and you saw me jogging down the road, and then this vehicle starts to follow me through the neighborhood, starts to tail me, slows down so that it sticks with me. You watch me going through the neighborhood, going up and down the streets, and there's this vehicle behind, and not just a vehicle, it's a truck, a pickup truck. And there's somebody in the bed of the pickup truck. And the person in the bed of that pickup truck is yelling and shouting at me. If you were in the neighborhood and you saw that pickup truck then pull in front of me while I'm jogging down the road and stop, and the person inside that pickup truck get out and start to approach me, yelling and shouting, telling me to stop. I don't know if you would consider that to be normal actions or not. But that's exactly what happened actually a couple of months ago down in Georgia. It didn't happen to me personally. It probably hasn't happened to you, but there was a young man, 25 years old, Ahmaud Arbery. I don't know if you saw this. I'm just now being made aware of this. He jogs all the time in his neighborhood. And one day while he's jogging, this pickup truck starts to follow him, people shouting at him to stop and turn around. They pull ahead. Somebody gets out of the vehicle. There's at least 2 people in the vehicle that are armed and telling him to stop and come answer their questions. And when he refuses, they shoot him dead. And just yesterday, video of this has surfaced about how this took place. And they did it, according to the police report, because he might have matched the description of a suspect in a recent rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. And so because he possibly could have matched a description of someone who may have committed some burglaries in the neighborhood, these folks, they weren't police officers, they weren't off-duty police officers, they weren't detectives, they weren't acting in any official capacity, but they were taking matters into their own hands and decided that because he looked like somebody that should be a suspect, they had the right to detain him and force him to answer their questions. And when he did not comply, they killed him. Now, I think that's injustice. I don't think that that's a just response and a just action. We're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to wait and see what happens, as a result of that. But we've got these terrible things like that happen, and we ask, how could such a thing take place? How could something like that happen here? But we have different thought processes. We've got different approaches to property and to laws, and it apparently gave these guys the feeling that they had the right to detain this guy jogging down the street. He wasn't in their yard. He wasn't trying to take anything from them. He wasn't on private property, but they thought that they had the right to do that. And we're going to have to see if the justice system, what it does with that scenario and that situation. If anybody wants to make any comments about that, I'd be more than happy to give you some room. When I'm getting ready to do a lesson on justice, and then that story comes across my screen, I just couldn't help but mention that, put that into place. Part of the problem is, you guys can continue thinking about if you've got a question or a thought on it. But I wanted to share this video. We talked about even sometimes in systems, there are systems that are, it's possible to continue to be unjust to certain people. And you may have seen this image before, and it's got its limitations, it's got its flaws, I understand that. But here's just an idea about sometimes we don't see that things aren't fair until we have the chance to step back and look at them. We talk about equality being so important, how important equality is versus, equity. Equity is giving, I think, if I'm understanding, the terms correctly that I saw associated with this picture, equity is giving everybody the same thing. Well, we've got these 3 kids on the far left, and they're trying to watch this game, but they can't see over the fence. So equity says, well, give all of them a box and they can stand on the box. Well, because the kids are different sizes, just because they all got the same thing doesn't necessarily mean that they all enjoy the same result, because one of those kids is still not able to see the game. So equality, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is not just giving everybody the same thing, but it's giving people what they need to accomplish what they are after. And so that middle image then, instead of giving all of them 1 box, you give one of them 2 boxes, and one of them doesn't need a box at all. He doesn't need a boost. And now they can all take part and they can all see what they're looking for. But then the third image is even more interesting. I think there's some deep things to consider, at least, again, with limitations. But there are sometimes systems in place. There are procedures and there are restrictions that don't need to be there. We can take down that wooden fence, and now we are including everyone. And so this third image is called inclusion. Why leave people on the outside when we can take down the wall that prevents anybody from seeing and being a part, and now everybody can see what's taking place. Now, again, we're talking about a professional baseball game. Yeah, there's a need to pay, to go in there and see that. I'm not talking about, just communism and, not requiring anybody to do anything. But what I'm saying is that it's interesting that sometimes even the systems in place, I didn't think twice about that fence until they said, you know what, we could just take the fence down and change systems altogether. Richard, I see you've got a hand up, and then anybody else wants to comment on any of this. But Richard, go ahead and unmute, and then we'll open up for other discussion.
The story about the jogger definitely applies to holiness and justice, because under the old law, if someone were to kill one of my relatives, I would had the right to be a kinsman redeemer and go after them and have them killed unless they got to the city of refuge. But under the new covenant, I don't have the right to be a vigilante. The government is supposed to take care of that. So that what they're doing, what those two men thought they were doing, was being vigilantes, and that's not allowed under holiness.
And that's exactly right. Taking those matters into our own hands, that's how you get the world that's blind. To me, the biggest weakness behind, if the whole world were eye for an eye, then everybody would wind up blind. That's not true, because in the correct system, only the people, who are dealing out justice, who are laying that punishment down, they're not wrong in what they're doing. And so there is no retribution to be done to them. And so that stops the system. But individuals and family groups or feuds, the Hatfields and McCoys, that kind of stuff, we carry these grudges and these complaints and these fights over and over and over again, and we don't let them go. And we just continue, instead of making justice, we just continue doing one unjust thing after another. And we return, what's the saying? Two wrongs don't make a right. Just because someone wrongs you, you don't then turn around and wrong them and think, oh, it's okay. But that's that human nature, right? That's that human system, those human dynamics. Here's the victim down here, and they've been struggling and they've been oppressed. And then if something happens and then they then become on top and they have the power now, well, it's very easy for them to become the victimizers. And the whole point of holiness, the whole point of following in God's footsteps through Christ, is that we break that cycle. We break the cycle of injustice, and we say enough is enough, and we bear that brunt, we bear that problem, even if it means us taking on a little bit of pain and enduring that, so that we can help stop the cycle. We'll go Autumn first and then Barron. So Autumn, go ahead and unmute yourself and share your thoughts. We start to wrap up.
It's really just kind of a meme that's been floating around, but I think it's accurate, and I think it's applicable here. That says it's hard to throw stones when you're busy washing feet. And the stoning was a symbol of justice, but Jesus brought in a different way, and that was to be a servant regardless of whether someone deserves it or not.
Right. And that's true.
I think that attitude is important.
Be turning over to Matthew 5, because I want to highlight that just in a really quick thought. But Barron, go ahead and share what you've got while folks are turning to Matthew 5.
Yeah, I think one of the things about this incident, this tragedy, like, it's not good, and the people who did it are not good, and they shouldn't have done it. But one of the problems when talking about justice nowadays is it's so laced with partisan issues of, you know, a long history of many problems. The civil rights movement, and before that, the civil rights movement was born out of social injustices, serious, real, problematic social injustices that needed to be dealt with. And that the things that the government was doing was wrong. And that's the same that Israel deals with. It's the same thing that First Peter deals with in his book. It's the same thing that John is trying to open the eyes of the churches to see in Revelation. And I think a problem is now that we take situations like this and we make them things that they either shouldn't be, like a systematic racial problem. This isn't a systematic racial problem. This is two people who are stupid doing stupid things and basing an entire system of a government or a people group on an incident, I would say is probably not good or accurate or anything along those lines. Just like I wouldn't want to base what happened at one church to be what happens at Petersville, how people think about Petersville. You know, I don't want someone to say, well, I went to this church down in Florida and they were really rude to me and none of them shook my hands and all that, and then assume that that's what it's going to be like in Alabama, in Florence. And so, you know, the Bible has systemic problems. You know, people at the top, Solomon is a good example of this. You know, when the young people ask him, what should we do? You know, they're like, give them more, just give them more to do. That's what they deserve, you know, and it goes back to Egypt. It goes back to the same problems of Egypt. So there are systemic problems and there are individual problems that, like Richard brought up, you know, if somebody did something to you, there are parts of the law that are to help you to get that back, to get that person's life back in some way. You know, and I use that kind of in a different way than probably the Bible would use, I guess. I don't know. So what I'm trying to say is when we take these issues and we make them into systemic problems, I think we're abusing that issue. And when we take when we take systemic issues and we try to make them individual, we might be doing wrong. So we have to look at instances of injustice as they are. And that's what the point that I'm just trying to make.
Yeah, but you know, I think you're highlighting the fact that's really hard to do because there are, you know,
it's very hard to do. Yes.
There are individual levels and then there are, you know, system-wide levels, and Solomon does become Pharaoh, you know, in the end. He goes back and does exactly all the things that God told Samuel. Look, Samuel, if they haven't rejected you, they rejected me from being king. And if you get a king, here's all the stuff he's going to do. And it's the same kinds of things that was happening in Egypt, but because you chose him, you're willing to put up with his, his tactics and everything. The idea, you know, what we can look for is patterns. You know, we can look for patterns of repetition. You know, and so we do. Again, because we've turned this whole thing so political, and anytime anything happens, everybody wants to take sides automatically. We can enter into touchy territory, but we still have to bring it up. You know, Mary Arnie over on Facebook brings up if the races were reversed, you know, if it was two black guys in a pickup truck and they stopped and shot a white guy jogging down the street in his own neighborhood, would we have seen a different response or not? You know, that's a fair question. And then what we do with the answer to that question, what we think the response to that question is, tells us what we need to do. I wanted to go back to what Autumn mentioned about, you know, you can't, it's hard to stone people when you're washing feet, and how even people that are not deserving or who are unjust, Christ teaches us to take care of them. In Matthew 5, verse 11, the ending of the Beatitudes, you know, says, bless those who persecute you, pray for those who spitefully use you, you know, and then it flows straight into that to say, you're the light of the world. You know, It goes right from saying you need to pray for the bad people, and then you're the light of the world. I'm going to ask Jeff, do you mind in a second if I ask you to read a scripture for us? Give me a thumbs up if you don't mind. Okay, turn to Galatians chapter 6. I'll give it to you in a second. Jim, do you mind reading? No, I'm going to go over to Joe Creasy. That's right. Joe, do you mind reading something for me? Great. If you'll turn to 1 Thessalonians 5, we'll get there in just a second too. So Galatians 6 for Jeff and 1 Thessalonians 5 for Joe. I got a book in the mail yesterday, just out of the blue. I was really surprised, but thankful. Crossway published this out. I'm assuming they sent this to churches all over the country. Many of you are familiar with the name John Piper. He's a theologian, writes a lot of books. He's written probably over 50 different books. And this is called Coronavirus and Christ. Now, we're not going to get into this, but he has some interesting thoughts that I've been kind of looking through. And one of the chapters is talking about creating good works in danger. And I thought it fit with our method, our study on justice tonight. So I wanted to introduce this idea. He talks about, what does he call it? Risky kindness. Risky kindness. He says one of God's purposes in this coronavirus and in any tragedy is that his people put to death self-pity and fear and give themselves to good deeds in the presence of danger. Christians lean toward need, not comfort, toward love, not safety. That's what our Savior is like. So he has this chapter about how our justice, how our response to situations, circumstances, and people around us to help bring them up in their times of distress, instead of taking advantage of them, using these moments to aid one another, become very important. And I want you to hear, he mentions these two passages that remind us of how this works. Jeff, read for us Galatians chapter 6. Unmute your mic and read us Galatians chapter 6, verse number 10. Galatians 6:10.
So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially those who are the household of faith.
Thank you. Do good to all people, especially those of the household of faith. It's a similar thought. Joe, go ahead and unmute your microphone. Read 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 15. 5:15 for me.
See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone.
Seek to do good to one another and to everyone. So the Bible says, Christians, we need to give preferential treatment to one another. As Christians, as brothers and sisters, as a family of God, we need to be especially good to the household of faith. But you still treat everybody well. You still go out of your way to be just to everybody. And then 1 Thessalonians 5 is that two wrongs don't make a right. Don't repay evil for evil. Now I bring that up because two wrongs don't make a right. But we do have Rogers watching, and he reminded us that even if two wrongs don't make a right, two rights make an airplane. There you go. That's my joke for tonight. Congratulations. Thank you very much. There you go. Two rights. WRIGHT. The Wright brothers. There we go. You're welcome. You're welcome. The need for justice, the need for kindness. I knew Jeff would appreciate that. Jim, not so much. Hey, you guys, we can talk about that one later. I want to finish. I saw this. You may have seen this over the past couple days. I've tried to track down the origin. As far as I can tell, it's a true account. I'm going to give you the short version so we can wrap up our lesson tonight. Margaret Mead, I don't know if you've heard her name before. She is a sociologist and anthropologist. She was born all the way back in 1900 and was really one of the pioneers in the field of anthropology, studying ancient civilizations and things. There's a lot of bad things that she's associated with. There's a lot of problems through the years, but then there are also some contributions that she made. But here was one interaction that I thought fit in with our discussion tonight. She was giving a lecture, and a student asked a question during the lecture, what she considered to be the first sign of civilization within a culture. You've got groups of people, they're hanging out there. What's the first sign that you have a civilized society, a civilized group of people? What is it that separates civilized man from the rest of the world? The student may have been expecting discussions of fish hooks or clay pots or tools or something else along that line, but instead, Margaret Mead said the first sign of civilization in any ancient culture was evidence of a femur, that's your thigh bone, that's the biggest bone in your body, a femur that had been broken and then healed. A broken femur. Mead then explained, in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You can't run from danger. You can't get to the river for a drink. You can't hunt for food. You are meat for prowling animals. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. A broken femur that is healed is evidence that someone has taken time to stay with the person who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, has tended the person through recovery. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts. In other words, we're at our best when we're serving other people. I thought that made some pretty strong points, some pretty strong evidence for why we need to be kind and gracious and just to other people. Jim, I saw your hand up. Go ahead. Unmute your mic.
I've heard that. I heard that actually it was called the Fred Jordan Mission. And first time I heard that was probably close to 25, maybe 30 years ago. We took some kids down to Skid Row, and he was speaking. Well, it was just he had a mission that he did was to feed everybody in Skid Row. And he had a lesson on that same thing. And I mean, it was amazing hearing you say that, because I've not heard her name in a long time, except for the first time I ever heard her name was, like I say, about 30 years ago when we took some kids down to the mission there in Skid Row to sit there to feed them. And he had just a little speech, and he talked about that. I said it was pretty amazing. But that's all I wanted to say.
That is, and I thought it was neat. I thought it was a good way to look at it. She's not necessarily coming from a Christian standpoint. She's just looking at what shows us that groups of people have really learned to work together and help one another. And that's a good point. You know, in the animal kingdom, I don't know if you've had experience with that. My dad had a car wreck. I've talked about that in sermons before. When I was 6 months old, he was in a body cast, broke his femur. That takes months to heal. And you have to let it heal properly, or you'll never be able to walk, correctly again. And so the time and the care that it is required to make it through an injury like that, you can't do it by yourself. And we can't make it through our problems unless we're able to help one another. So we want to start with the holiness of God. And we want to understand that God shows us how his holiness can be given to us, how we can be considered holy ourselves. And then what do we do with that? We take that holiness and we turn around and we shine the light of justice on the world around us. And we show that to other people in their darkest times, in their most troubling difficulties, in danger. We have risky kindness, because that's what gets people's attention the most. And that has the potential to do the most good. So those are just some themes for us to think about. We're going to carry this on. Next week, we're going to ask the question, why do we need to be concerned about justice? What is it that causes justice to be something we have to seek in the first place? So be thinking about that. be thinking about how that'll build into next week's study, and hopefully you'll join us again for that. I want to finish out our time tonight before everybody goes their separate ways and let you know about some potential good news that we're hoping to put into place on Sunday. So the elders have been meeting, they've been praying, they've been contacting folks during all this, and they had another meeting on Monday night discussing options. We know that on May 15th, we're supposed to have another press conference, another information session from our governor, the government here in Alabama, with changes and updates. Because of restrictions that have been kind of lifted a little bit, and hopefully everybody's still taking precautions, we're going to institute a new thing. We're going to try something this coming Sunday. This will be May the 10th. This will be Mother's Day at 5 o'clock Sunday evening. We're going to attempt what they're calling a drive-in service. So we're going to see who is available and interested in bringing their vehicle to the parking lot of the church building. And we'll have set up for how everybody can park and interact with one another. You're going to be, if you want to bring a lawn chair, you want to bring your camp chair and sit out right beside your vehicle. We'll keep everybody separated. We're going to try to have a singing service together, and we're going to try to have some time where we can kind of be in the same location without breaking any rules or getting in trouble with any kind of restrictions that are going on. But I wanted to start getting you thinking about that. We'll have more announcements about it, more guidelines about how we're going to do it. But if that seems like something that's going to be interesting to you, be thinking about this coming Sunday at 5 p.m. Coming down to the Petersville Church of Christ parking lot, and we'll have an opportunity to sing together and enjoy some fellowship. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Thank you for joining us. Jim had a hand up. He may have an announcement about that. I'm going to let him go ahead. Unmute.
No, I was just going to get with you, Adam. We have an FM receiver there at the building. We're going to take a look at it. We've actually got FM to where we don't know if we can go through it on a radio channel or not. So we're going to take a look at it. But it's something that we were using for like Joanne and those who were having the ear things.
Okay,
we're thinking
good.
about we may be able to use that.
Awesome.
So,
awesome. Yeah, we've been
tomorrow.
ever since Monday, we've been looking at logistics and looking at how to make this stuff happen. And so there's a couple of different options that are floating around, and we're going to try to make it, the best way possible. But it may be some, we'll hopefully be able to unload that. But Jim and I are going to get together. I'm glad to hear that. We might possibly have that as an option for us. But I'm gonna wrap us up, if you don't mind, with a prayer, and then I'll end the meeting after we've finished our prayer time together. So if you would bow with me, if you're on Boxcast, Roku, or Facebook Live, feel free to offer a prayer as we finish our time together tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, I'm so thankful for the time that we have right now to be in our homes, to be separated, but also to share in a common study and a common thought, seeking your justice, seeking your holiness. We're reminded of the words in Micah that the things that you have given for us to do, to love justice, to walk humbly with you, to seek mercy. Help us to do that right now. Help us to look for opportunities in the midst of this difficult and strange time in our lives, not to get frustrated, not to give in to negative thoughts and anxieties and fears, but to do the best that we